Chapter 1. Black Coffee, White Coats. Dr. Julian Hale's world was measured in variables, equations, and sterile light. His mornings began with a precise routine: alarm at 5:45, treadmill at 6 o'clock, shower at 6:30, lab coat buttoned by 7 o'clock, and at exactly 7:15, he stepped into Caf Cosimo, the quiet corner coffee shop nestled between a dry cleaner and a bookstore he'd never set foot in. Julian liked the place because no one talked to him there. The baristas moved like clockwork, polite but unobtrusive. His order was always the same: black coffee, no sugar, no milk, no fuss, just fuel. He appreciated that no one asked how he slept or what his weekend plans were. The silence gave him space to run formulas in his head, revisit theories, and troubleshoot experimental flaws before he even stepped into the lab. The cafe was simply a waypoint in his controlled life, but on a particularly crisp Monday morning, something was off. His cup-white cardboard, reliably anonymous, no bore unfamiliar handwriting. A soft, looping scroll circled the rim. Even Constance need change to stay balanced. He blinked. That wasn't standard branding. It certainly wasn't science. He stared at the quote, heart inexplicably thudding. The phrase clung to his mind like static electricity. "Everything okay with your order?" a voice asked, light and warm, like cinnamon. Julian looked up and saw her. She wasn't the usual guy who handed him his coffee without eye contact. This barista was newer, maybe just new to the front counter. Dark curls escaped from a loosely pinned bun, her apron smudged with a splash of caramel. She had wide, observant eyes that sparkled like she knew a secret the world had yet to discover. He cleared his throat. "It's fine," he replied, voice low. "I just wasn't expecting." He motioned awkwardly at the cup. "Oh, the quote," she said, grinning. "I started writing one a day. I thought people could use a little poetry with their caffeine. Hope that's not too unscientific for you." Julian didn't smile, but he didn't walk out either. Instead, he stared at the quote again. Somehow, it had scratched an itch he didn't know existed right there. Between his relentless calculations and the empty white space of his life, he walked out of Caf Cosimo 5 minutes later, coffee in hand, equations temporarily forgotten. That morning, for the first time in years, Julian arrived at the lab 5 minutes late. Chapter 2. The quote that stirred the beaker. The next morning, the rain tapped like gentle fingers on the lab windows, a soft, rhythmic distraction that Julian tried to ignore as he peered through his microscope. His latest trial had stalled again. No matter how he tweaked the compound, the results plateaued. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, frustration coiling beneath his calm surface. He glanced at the clock. 7:12. Without much thought, he grabbed his coat and umbrella, leaving his calculations mid-process. The cafe was only a 5-minute walk away, but today, the walk felt heavier. The sky was gray, the sidewalks slick. His umbrella resisted the wind like it had better places to be. When Julian stepped into Caf Cosimo, the warmth of the place wrapped around him like a gentle blanket. Coffee beans, baked goods, soft jazz humming in the background. He joined the short line, eyes scanning for her. There she was, Ivy, according to the name tag he'd failed to notice yesterday. She was laughing with a customer, completely unbothered by the dreariness outside. Her presence, like the quote on yesterday's cup, felt almost destabilizing. "Black coffee?" she asked when it was his turn, already reaching for a cup. Julian nodded, tugging at the cuff of his sleeve. "No quote today?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Ivy's smile deepened as she handed him his coffee. "Of course there's a quote." He looked down. This one was written a bit smaller, nestled just above the sleeve. Even the most controlled reactions need a catalyst. He stared at it. That was uncanny. Julian blinked at the cup, heart ticking faster than his analytical brain liked. The phrasing, the timing. His current research was literally about chemical catalysts. He was stuck on one. And here it was, scrawled in ink on a disposable cup by a woman who couldn't possibly know. "You're staring at it like it's radioactive," Ivy teased, leaning her elbows on the counter. He looked up sharply. "It's just eerily relevant. Maybe the universe is trying to tell you something," she said, then quickly added, "Or maybe I'm psychic." But only before 9 a.m. A breath, almost a laugh, escaped him. It startled them both. Julian stepped aside with his coffee, retreating to the farthest corner of the cafe. He sat for the first time in months, the coffee untouched. He read the quote again and again. For once, the formulas could wait. Chapter 3. Caffeine and Curiosity. Julian returned the next morning, then the next, and the next after that. At first, he told himself it was just part of the routine and efficient way to maintain consistency in his mornings, but even he couldn't ignore the shift. He no longer left the cafe immediately. Instead, he lingered near the pickup counter, waiting to see what she'd write next. Ivy had a different quote ready each day, written in that same looping handwriting that now lived rent-free in Julian's mind. Some were whimsical, others thought-provoking, and occasionally, one landed so precisely in the crevices of his current research or mood. It was unsettling, but it wasn't just the quotes anymore. It was her. The way Ivy hummed softly while steaming milk, The flour smudge on her cheek when she worked the early baking shift. The way she always looked people in the ice like they weren't just customers, but living, breathing stories. It was disarming. Julian, the man who once timed his entire morning down to the second, now found himself arriving 5 minutes early and staying 10 minutes late. Morning, Professor Particle, Ivy greeted on Thursday, sliding his cup toward him with a smile. Today's quote read, "Chaos is just unrecognized beauty." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not a professor." "Well, you give Professor energy. Serious, intense, a little mysterious," she said, tilting her head. "And you always smell faintly of ethanol and pine soap." Julian blinked. "That's accurate." "I'm observant," she replied with a wink. His lips twitched, dangerously close to a smile. "You're remarkably comfortable teasing strangers. I don't think you're a stranger anymore." Her words sat between them for a second too long. Ivy didn't pull them back, didn't flinch. Julian, ever the scientist, simply absorbed him, quietly fascinated by the flutter in his chest. Back at the lab, Julian tried to refocus, but the data on his screen blurred. He found himself tapping her quote into the margins of his notes, unintentionally doodling the swirl of her signature curl. He didn't know what was happening. He didn't have the variables. But Julian Hale was starting to admit the truth. He wasn't coming back for the coffee. He was coming back for her chapter 4. Stirring the formula, Julian stared at his whiteboard, markers in hand, equations scrolled in every direction. But all he could think about was the sound of Ivy's laugh when she accidentally spilled cinnamon on a customer's sleeve that morning. It was soft, breathy, unfiltered joy. It echoed in his mind louder than any chemical reaction ever had. He was losing control of the one thing he'd always been certain of himself. For years, Julian had lived in a neatly arranged life of sterile labs and datasheets. His emotional world kept under glass like a fragile specimen. But lately, he'd been experimenting in a different kind of lab. The cafe had become his morning ritual. And Ivy, she was becoming his variable that day. Instead of his usual black coffee, he hesitated, feeling brave. Ivy asked with a knowing smirk. Julian eyed the menu. "What's a cortado?" She laughed. "A little espresso, a little warm milk. Balanced, smooth, kind of like you, if you ever relaxed." He raised an eyebrow. "Let's try it." "Really?" she teased, pretending to write it down like it was a monumental order. Julian Hale, deviating from black coffee. "I should call the Nobel Committee. I'm allowed a controlled experiment." "Sure," she said, sliding the cup toward him, this time with a playful doodle of a beaker and the quote. "Sometimes the formula needs a wild card." Back in the lab, the cortado's subtle warmth stayed with him longer than expected. He took his lab coat off a little earlier. He answered his intern with something resembling patience. When a colleague joked about his coffee habit, Julian didn't bristle, he smirked. And when his mind wandered, it wasn't to the intricacies of compound behavior, it was to Ivy's eyes when she smiled, the way her hand rested on the edge of the counter when she was lost in thought, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon that seemed to follow her like a whisper dot by the end of the week. Julian had memorized more about Ivy's laugh than he had about any molecule in months. Something was stirring inside Hyman for the first time. He wasn't trying to stop it. He was letting it bubble over. Chapter 5. A latte more than usual. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Ivy handed Julian his coffee with a note tucked beneath a sleeve. Not a quote this time, but a question, handwritten in her neat slanted script. "What did you want to be when you were a kid?" Julian stood frozen for a second, surprised by how such a simple question could feel so intimate. He looked up at her, but Ivy was already busy taking another order, her face a careful mix of casual and curious. Later, back at the lab, he found himself unable to focus. The question tugged at something buried deep, something soft and untouched. That evening, he returned to the cafe. The first time he'd ever gone back twice in one day. "I wanted to be an astronaut," he admitted, surprising both of them. Not because of the science, because of the silence. Ivy smiled as she handed him a latte, his third new drink in as many weeks. "Let me guess," she said. "You liked the idea of being far away, floating, no one bothering you." He nodded. "Exactly, and now?" Julian took a slow sip. "Now I don't mind the noise so much." She leaned on the counter, her voice gentler than usual. "When I was 10, I wanted to be a painter for children's books. My grandma used to say I had magic in my fingertips." "You still paint?" Ivy hesitated, then nodded. "Not much lately. I work here most mornings, help my aunt in the afternoons. Painting feels distant sometimes, like a dream I'm always just shy of reaching." Julian, who had spent his life chasing one measurable goal after another, felt a strange ache at the thought of her dreams collecting dust. "You should paint more," he said, almost too quickly. "The world could use your kind of color." Her eyes softened. "Thank you, Professor Particle." He groaned, shaking his head. "That nickname is going to stick, isn't it?" "Oh, absolutely," she said, beaming. "It suits you." That night, Julian lay in bed, the image of Ivy painting vivid in his mind. The way she talked about her art like it was both her greatest love and greatest loss and adult. Something in him For the first time in years, he didn't dream of formulas or failures. He dreamed of BRUSHSTROKES. And cinnamon. Chapter 6. A day off and a walk through color. Saturday morning arrived with a rare gift, a clear calendar and no lab emergencies. Julian sat in his apartment staring at the blinking cursor on an empty research report. But his mind wandered back to the smell of fresh paint Ivy had described a few days ago. As if summoned by thought, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Street art fair today on 5th. Thought of you. Ivy. Julian stared at it, thumb hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't spontaneous. He didn't do street fairs, but the idea of seeing Ivy outside the coffee counter tugged at something unspoken. He didn't reply. He just showed up. The fair was a vivid explosion of color banners waving in the summer breeze, food trucks, booths bursting with canvases, handmade crafts, and the hum of acoustic guitars. Julian wove through the crowd awkwardly, scanning until he spotted her near a chalk mural of a moonlit CITISCAPE. She wore a sunflower yellow dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, a smudge of blue paint on her cheek. She looked nothing like the Ivy behind the espresso machine. She looked free. You came, she said, pleasantly surprised. I was in the area, he lied, poorly. Ivy grinned. In the area of this extremely specific art fair. Julian shrugged, lips twitching. I needed a dose of chaos. Lucky for you, I know a good supplier. She grabbed his hand without warning and led him past vendors and canvas walls, stopping at a booth filled with her paintings. Julian's eyes moved over watercolor cityscapes, swirling galaxies, and quiet portraits with hidden glimmers. These are yours, he asked, genuinely awed. She nodded, suddenly shy. I sell a few when I can. It's not science, but it's more than science, he murmured, and meant it. They spent the afternoon weaving between colors and sounds. Julian tried cotton candy for the first time, hated it, and attempted to win. Ivy, a painted mug at the ring toss, failed spectacularly, but she laughed so hard, he swore he'd do it again just to hear it at one point. They sat on a bench beneath a string of lanterns, watching a street performer juggle fire. Ivy leaned her head on his shoulder without asking. Julian didn't move. He didn't know what kind of experiment this was, what rules governed this connection, but in that moment he didn't care. The world was noisy, unpredictable, and chaotic. And for once, he didn't want to tune it out. Chapter 7. Cracked beakers and crumbling walls. The hum of the centrifuge was the only sound in the lab, and even that was starting to feel like a taunt. Julian's experiment, the one he'd sunk months into, was unraveling. The reaction was failing. Again, and again, and again. He double-checked the reagent levels, reran the calculation, changed the temperature. Still, nothing aligned with the projected model. His jaw clenched. His heart raced. The data mocked him, and then the worst sound of all, a sharp crack of glass. Julian had slammed a beaker down harder than he realized. Shards scattered across the table, a few pieces cutting into the base of his palm. Blood bloomed. He barely felt it. He was too deep in the spiral of failure, of pressure, of the cold, familiar voice in his head, whispering, you're wasting time. You should be better than this. You've built your life on success, so what are you without it? And then, like sunlight on a stormy day, Ivy's voice broke through the chaos. Julian. He turned sharply. She stood at the doorway, holding a paper bag in one hand and a to-go coffee tray in the other. Her expression softened the moment she saw his hand. Oh my God, you're bleeding. I'm fine, he muttered, grabbing a cloth from the side table. Avoiding her eyes. You're not, she said, walking toward him. You've been off all week. I thought maybe you could use a break. I brought lunch. I didn't ask for it. Her steps paused. Her voice was quieter now. No, but you looked like you needed it. He didn't know how to respond. Her kindness was a spotlight on everything he tried to hide. I don't have time for distractions, Ivy, he said, too sharply. She flinched, just slightly. Is that what I am? Julian's mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't meant it, not like that. But it was out now, and it hung in the room like spilled acid. I just can't afford to get pulled away from this, he said more softly, trying to fix it. Ivy stood still. Her warmth seemed to dim. You're allowed to need people, Julian. You're not a failed experiment just because something isn't working right away. He couldn't answer. His chest felt tight, like all the air had been drained from the room. She placed the paper bag on the table carefully, like it might shatter too, and whispered, eat something when you remember you're human. And then she walked out. Julian stared at the door long after she was gone, the sting of her absence sharper than the glass in his skin. The worst part wasn't that the experiment had failed, it was that he had Chapter 8. Apologies and almond croissants the next morning. Julian stood in front of Caf Cosimo's door for a full 3 minutes before going in. He felt ridiculous in one hand. He held a small paper bag from a French bakery 3 blocks away. In the other, a folded apology note he'd written and rewritten 3 times the moment he stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe hit him, but it wasn't comforting today. It felt like standing in a room that no longer welcomed him. Ivy was behind the counter, focused on the espresso machine, laughter dimmer, smile shorter. She greeted other customers with her usual kindness, but when she saw him, her expression faltered for only a second before returning to neutral. "Morning," she said, voice polite. Not cold, but not warm either. Julian stepped forward. "Can I talk to you for a second?" She kept working. "We're kind of busy." "Julian, I know," he said, placing the bakery bag on the counter. "I brought almond croissants. Your favorite, I think. You mentioned them once." Ivy glanced down. "Bribery." "No," he said quietly. "An apology." That made her look at him, rarely look. Her eyes were tired. "Guarded you were cruel." "I know," he said. "I was overwhelmed. But that's not an excuse." The line was building behind him. A barista called Ivy's name from the back. Still, she didn't move. Julian took a breath. "You've been the best part of my days. And I pushed you away because I didn't know how to let you in. But I want to learn." There it was, raw, unfiltered, unpracticed. The kind of confession no lab ever prepared him for. She studied him for a long second. Then, finally, she said, "I'm not here to make your life sweeter only when it's convenient. I don't want that either." Another pause. Then Ivy reached for the bag, opened it, and pulled out a croissant. She took a slow bite, then gave the faintest smile. "They better be from Leclerc's," she said. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "They are." Ivy shook her head. "Just slightly. You're still a work in progress." "Professor Particle, isn't everyone?" he asked. She handed him his coffee. No quote this time. Just a simple heart drawn beside his name. It was more than enough. Chapter 9. A spark in the chaos. The cafe was quiet that night. The usual hum of conversation replaced by the soft clinking of mugs and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Julian sat at the far booth, sipping a cappuccino. Ivy had insisted he try to expand his palate. She'd said with a wink. He had started staying later, not because the coffee had improved, but because the silence between him and Ivy had become something else entirely comfortable, charged. Even tonight Ivy joined him with her own mug, wiping her hands on a towel as she slid into the seat across from him. She looked tired, her apron flecked with flour and her curls messier than usual, but her smile when she looked at him, it was soft and unguarded. "Long day?" he asked. "Yeah," she exhaled. "Double shift. My feet hate me. But I wanted to show you something." She pulled a folded sketchbook from her bag and opened it to a pencil drawing. Julian leaned in and froze. It was him. Not some caricature or literal portrait. It was Julian, in profile mid-thought, seated at a cafe table with his coffee cradled between his palms. But what struck him most was the way she'd captured him, not as the aloof scientist he projected to the world, but as something quieter, softer, someone real. "I sketched it last week," Ivy said gently. "You just looked so present, like you weren't carrying the whole universe for once." Julian stared at the drawing. A warmth rose in his chest that had nothing to do with coffee. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "You don't have to say anything," she replied, her eyes holding his. "I just wanted you to see what I see." Julian's throat tightened. He'd spent years building walls to protect his focus, his drive, his solitude. But this woman, this barista with paint on her hands and poetry on her cups, was peeling back layers he didn't know still existed. "Ivy," he said quietly, "I don't know how to be this version of me, the one you see." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Then let's figure it out together," she said. For the first time in his life, Julian didn't feel the need to solve anything. He just felt, and that, he realized, was a miracle no equation could explain. Chapter 10. Her opportunity. His obsession. The morning started like any other. Julian walked into Café, expecting the familiar comfort of Ivy's grin and a warm cup of something with an inspiring quote. But today her smile was different. It held excitement and hesitation. "I got an email last night," she said as she slid his cup across the counter. "An invitation. A gallery in Paris wants to showcase my work. It's for an emerging artists exhibit, just a few slots. But they picked me." Julian stared at her. Coffee forgotten. The quote on the sleeve unread. "That's amazing," he said. And it was, but his voice cracked slightly at the end. Ivy noticed. "It's not for sure. I mean, I haven't decided. It would mean leaving for at least 2 months. Maybe more." A silence stretched between them. Ivy busied herself with a new order, but Julian didn't move. The idea of this place without her, the stillness of the cafe, her voice absent, the blank space where color used to be, it hit him harder than any lab failure ever had. Later that day, back at the university lab, Julian stared blankly at his data sheets. The formulas blurred, the graphs didn't make sense. He adjusted his calculations, rewrote equations, doubled down on his hours, anything to keep his mind off of her, because the truth was, his research was nearing a breakthrough, one he'd been chasing for nearly a year. It demanded everything: precision, patience, sacrifice. He couldn't afford distractions now, not when he was so close, but no matter how tightly he clung to the numbers, his thoughts kept circling back to Ivy, her laughter when she teased him, the quiet focus in her eyes when she painted, the gentle way she touched the rim of his coffee cup before handing it over like it was something sacred. He was falling, and that terrified him. That evening he received a call from the university director, praising his progress and requesting early drafts for a potential publication. Julian hung up, and all he could feel was hollow. Ivy had the chance of a lifetime. And he had everything. he ever worked for sitting right in front of him. They were standing at the edge of two different dreams. And for the first time, he didn't know which one he wanted more. Chapter 11. Unspoken goodbyes. The cafe felt different. It wasn't the music or the lighting or the scent of pastries in the air, it was her. Ivy moved behind the counter with practiced grace, but there was a subtle distance to her now, like she was already half a world away. Julian stood in line, clutching his coat, debating if he should say what had been pressing against his chest for days. But when he reached the counter, the words stayed trapped behind his teeth. Black coffee? Ivy asked, her tone carefully neutral. He nodded. No quote today. She handed over the cup, and for the first time in weeks, the sleeve was blank. Julian didn't know what hurt more, the absence of her handwritten words, or the absence of her warmth. She glanced over at him as she wiped the counter. I booked the flight, she said softly. Next week. He swallowed. That's great. You deserve it. Silence. Customers bustled around them, but the space between Julian and Ivy stretched wide and sharp. I thought you'd be happy, she added, voice quieter. I am, he said, too quickly. It's just, I didn't think it would happen this fast. Her smile was bittersweet. Dreams don't wait for convenient timing. Julian, you taught me that you never slow down for anything. Why should I? He flinched. She wasn't wrong. He had thrown himself into his work these past few days, burying every thought of her under piles of data and unread emails. He hadn't reached out, hadn't asked her to stay, hadn't said anything. I didn't mean to shut you out, he said finally. I know, she whispered, but it still felt like you did. Julian stood there, coffee cooling in his hand, 100 words piling up in his throat, and still he said nothing more. Ivy nodded once, then turned away to help the next customer, and just like that, it was clear she wasn't waiting for him anymore. As Julian walked out of Caf Cosim, the bell above the door chimed behind him bright and final, and he realized, too late, that not saying goodbye had been the loudest silence of all. Chapter 12. The missing variable. Julian stared at the results on his screen, the blinking cursor beside the final calculation of his long-awaited formula. It worked. After months of sleepless nights, failures, revisions, and tunnel vision focus, he had done it. The chemical reaction was stable, the model repeatable, a breakthrough in his field, a paper-worthy discovery. But as the cursor blinked, so did the hollow ache inside his chest. He should have felt elation, triumph, at the very least, relief. Instead, he felt empty. The lab was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigeration unit and the occasional creak of the building settling. Julian looked around. He was alone. He had been for days. Ivy hadn't texted since the last time he saw her. He hadn't messaged either. He had chosen the work, the project, the safety of predictable outcomes. He'd convinced himself it was the responsible thing to do. But now, sitting in front of a screen full of success, all he could think of was a warm voice offering him chaos in a cup. A girl who doodled beakers and stars and painted his silence like it meant something. He stood up suddenly, pushing the stool back with a sharp scrape, pacing the lab. His mind raced. He hadn't realized it before, but Ivy had been the catalyst all along, not just to his feelings, but to his creativity, his capacity for joy, his willingness to feel. She hadn't distracted him. She had lit the fire under everything. He thought he already knew, and in trying to protect his formula, he had lost his variable. Julian reached into his notebook and flipped past pages of dense notes and chemical drawings. At the back, almost forgotten, was a folded napkin. Ivy had given it to him weeks ago. Just a playful scribble of a quote in her handwriting. Even atoms need a little energy to bond. He ran his fingers over the ink, then pressed his eyes shut. He had everything he thought he wanted, but none of it mattered without her. In all his experiments, he had never accounted for the missing variable. Love. Chapter 13. The painting on the Caf wall cave. Cosimo felt colder without her. Julian hadn't stepped inside since Ivy left, but today something pulled him back, a quiet gravity he couldn't shake. Maybe it was habit, maybe guilt, or maybe hope, stubborn and aching, still clinging to the scent of espresso and vanilla. He walked through the door slowly, shoulders hunched against the weight in his chest. The bell chimed. No one turned. The usual morning bustle was in full swing, but it all blurred in his periphery. He didn't care about coffee. He didn't care about anything until he saw it. Hanging on the far wall, above the corner table he used to sit at, was her painting. Julian moved toward it like in a trance. The cafe noise faded until only his heartbeat remained. It was a portrait, not literal, but unmistakably him, a figure, in a white lab coat seated at a coffee shop table, surrounded by a swirling universe of color. Beakers dissolved into blooming flowers. Equations melted into constellations. His usually tight posture had softened in the painting. His face caught mid-thought, but peaceful, open, alive. At the bottom, signed in Ivy's familiar flourish, was the title, Constant. Beneath it, in tiny, near-invisible handwriting, she had written a single message: even scientists need stars. Julian swallowed hard. Emotion rose fast and sharp in his chest, crashing against his ribs. This wasn't just a goodbye, it was a gift. She had left a piece of herself behind in color, in brushstrokes, in memory, a quiet declaration that she had seen him for who he was, and maybe more importantly, who he could become. He stood there for a long time, hand resting on the back of the chair he used to occupy, heart thudding with something more than regret. The painting wasn't a door closing, that was a map, and he knew exactly where it was pointing. Chapter 14. Boarding. Gate 1 for B. Julian had never bought an international plane ticket in such a rush or with such little planning. No itinerary, no hotel, no backup, just a hastily packed suitcase, a nearly expired passport, and a single thought thundering through his head. Find her. He was breathless as he ran through the terminal. The announcement for boarding echoing through the airport speakers. Gate 1 for B was a blur of movement, people rolling suitcases, calling loved ones, clutching passports. He didn't care. He scanned the crowd like a man possessed, searching for even a glimpse of color that might resemble Ivy, but of course, she wasn't there. Not yet. He wasn't catching her leaving. He was going to her. He approached the counter, panting. Is this the flight to Paris? The attendant nodded, just about to finish boarding. Julian hesitated only a moment before reaching into his coat and pulling out the small folded napkin he had carried for weeks, the one with her, quote, even atoms need a little energy to bond. He smiled faintly, his heart pounding as he handed over his boarding pass. The plane lifted into the sky 2 hours later, clouds brushing past the window as he stared out at the horizon. The lights of the city disappeared beneath them, but his mind wasn't on what he'd left behind. It was on a girl with paint-stained fingers and laughter in her eyes. A girl who had made him taste color in a world of black and white. He didn't know where her gallery was. Didn't know if she'd even want to see him. But he knew one thing with clarity now. He'd been chasing answers all his life, and she was the only one who had ever made the questions feel worth asking. Chapter 15. Brewing Love. The Paris air was brisk, tinged with the scent of fresh bread and rain-soaked cobblestones. Julian wandered through the narrow streets of the Marais, his suitcase forgotten in a cheap hotel room he'd checked into without thinking. His only real luggage was the folded napkin in his coat pocket and the painting in his mind constant. He searched gallery after gallery with Ivy's name clutched like a lifeline in his phone notes. Finally, on the third day, he found it, a small exhibit nestled inside a boutique space with Ivy trailing down the front window. Her name was on the chalkboard sign outside, under a hand-drawn coffee cup and a swirl of stars. He stepped in. Heart thunderous, there were a dozen people inside, murmuring about brushstrokes and color palettes. But he barely heard them. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the walls until there she was, standing by a window, holding a paper cup from the gallery's pop-up cafe, her gaze lost in the Paris skyline. Julian walked up behind her, quiet but unflinching. When she turned, her eyes widened shocked disbelief, and something that shimmered just beneath the surface. He offered her a paper cup from the tray beside them. On it, in his careful handwriting, was her quote, even constants need change to stay balanced. She laughed softly, tears rising to her eyes. That was the first one I ever wrote for you. I know, he said. It rewrote everything I thought I understood. Ivy stepped closer, holding the cup between them like something fragile and sacred. Why are you here? Because I forgot something, he whispered. The most important part of my formula. Her breath caught you, he said. You were the spark, the variable, the color I never factored in. She reached up, cupped his face with a paint-stained hand. And what now, Professor Particle? Julian smiled, the kind of smile that only existed for her. Now we brew something new together. As the gallery buzzed around them and the Parisian sky opened into a soft drizzle, they stood in the center of it, all two opposites that had finally found their balance, coffee in hand, hearts wide open. Love, finally, perfectly brewed.